So after the Civil War, the North and the South need to be rejoined, and the South needs to be rebuilt after the destruction from the Civil War. As you take a look at this timeline, you'll see that after President Lincoln is unfortunately assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Democrat, takes over. After him, the famous general in the war, Ulysses S. Grant, will take over as the next president. And after his presidency, Reconstruction will end. A lot of this is due to some scandals and because the Republican Party wanted to keep the presidency. As we go through this unit, you'll notice there are some important events and vocabulary terms. So first up, we see the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. 14th and 15th, the 14th states that African Americans will now be citizens. And the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote. The Freedmen's Bureau is set up to help African Americans after slavery ends. And we see in some of that red highlighting some of the negative things that happen, such as black codes, which limit African American rights, the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization, and other negative things. So there are three plans for Reconstruction after the Civil War. First is Lincoln's plan. He wanted to be very easy on the South. He wanted 10% of Southerners to pledge allegiance to the North, and he wanted to quickly bring them back into the Union. This fails because of his assassination. Next, President Johnson, a Democrat, has a very similar plan. He wants to be very lenient in his presidential Reconstruction. Lenient means to be easy on someone, not too difficult. He wanted to do that primarily because he is highly racist, does not see a need to strongly protect African American rights. And he also wanted to get a lot of support from his Southern friends. But his plan also does not pass because in order to pass laws, the president must first wait for Congress to write the law. So this is going to fail. Congress at this time was controlled by the Republicans, and there was an extreme or really radical group called the Radical Republicans, and they wanted to help African Americans the most. So they mandate that these laws such as the 14th, 15th, and 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments be passed, and that they were going to use the military to occupy the South. So as we see these military districts, the southern states do not have their governments anymore. Okay, northern military generals are going to be running these governments. So this is going to anger many of the Southerners. So it's with the protection of the northern military, the Union military, that African Americans will be very much protected during Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is a great time for African Americans compared to slavery. After Reconstruction, though, African Americans are going to see a lot of terror and violence. So the most important amendments to the Constitution or additions are the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And the most simplest way we have to remember that is free citizens vote. So abolishing slavery in the 13th Amendment, granting citizenship to those born in America under the 14th Amendment, and granting the right to vote to all citizens. And at this time, this was intended to include African American men. And under these Reconstruction governments, we see many African Americans into politics for the first time. And many do very good jobs, and unfortunately, they will not enter politics for a while after Reconstruction ends. After slavery is abolished, many African Americans remain down south and still work on farms, but receive income or a salary. It took a while for the African Americans to do well, primarily because this institution of sharecropping, which is very similar to tenant farming, took place. And this is where farmers would have to rent their land and their supplies and give part of their goods to the landowner. This became a cycle of debt, and debt, meaning owing money, led to poverty. Some states had passed state laws called black codes that restricted or took away rights of African Americans. A lot of laws like loitering. So in other words, if African American men in particular, in groups of 2 or 3 or more, were on a street corner just hanging out because they couldn't find work, they would become arrested. And while they were in jail, they would be rented out to corporations to work for free. Many have argued, historians that is, that this was an extension of slavery, and that in fact slavery never truly ended until the 1940s and 1950s, because after the Civil War, many African Americans would become arrested, put into prisons, and forced to do hard labor without any pay. One of the good things that the government did to help out African Americans after the Civil War was set up something called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the goal was to help African Americans. This was a very positive group. Between education, childcare, health care, and job training, African Americans and impoverished whites or poor whites received a lot of help from the government. Earlier I noted that President Johnson was racist. He was a Southern Democrat and did not believe in equality in protection of rights for African Americans. He eventually was going to become impeached, which means he was put on trial, though he was not removed from office. He violated something called the Tenure of Office Act, and basically Congress was upset with him because he was vetoing or canceling almost all civil rights bills that were to protect African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan originally began during the Reconstruction era, and it was a hate group aimed at inciting terror and fear, and sometimes using violence against Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and Black Americans. They used a lot of terror tactics and also forced people to vote for the Democratic Party in the South. At this time, voting was not secret and could be intimidated by outside groups. As Reconstruction went on, and under the presidencies of Johnson and Grant, there were scandals that rocked the nation. Some of them were the Credit Mobilier scandals, where there was funding from the government being siphoned off or given to corporations, and support for the Republican Party went down because of that. And the 1876 election, the Republican candidate did not receive the majority of the electoral votes, but they struck a deal with the Democrats in Congress in order to give them the presidency. As a result, the Republicans wanted the White House, and they promised the South they would take the soldiers away and end Reconstruction. And the southern districts were no longer military districts, and the state governments got their power back. African Americans slowly and surely began to lose freedoms and rights throughout the late 1800s up until the mid-1900s. Homer Plessy was a man of mixed background. He was mostly white, though he did have some African heritage, and as a result, when he sat in a train car that was segregated by race, he sued to say that he should be able to sit anywhere. The state said that they should be able to discriminate based on their prerogative or their view, and this made it all the way to the Supreme Court under the case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And the court said that segregation is legal as long as facilities are separate but equal. This was not true. Nothing was ever equal for African Americans as a result, and this will not get resolved until the 20th century.